Brainworx BX Console SSL 4000E and 4000G, the sound of classic hits and modern masterpieces. Brought to you by Brainworx, Plugin Alliance, and officially endorsed by Solid State Logic. In this video, we'll cover every parameter to fully understand exactly how these amazing plugins work. Learn it all in one video and get back to creating the next hit song full of analog character and tone. Alright, so here we have the Brainworx BX Console SSL 4000E and 4000G. In this video, we're going to go over everything, the filters, compressor, expander, EQ, so on and so forth, and there will be time code, by the way, in the description below if you want to hop around between the different sections here. Also, everything you see in this video, or pretty much everything, will be applicable to the other Plugin Alliance channel strips, like the Neve or the Focusrite. Of course, they might employ things in a slightly different way, or have different options, but essentially everything you see here can be applied to those as well. And also, channel strips, honestly, from any company at all. So here on our E and G, you can see they're laid out pretty much exactly the same. So we're going to hop back and forth, between these two different versions. Of course, they're going to sound different because they're based on different hardware, but essentially they're going to operate in the pretty much the same way. Only a couple little differences here. All right, so right now we're looking at the stereo version of these here. We're going to use that for most of the examples here. But there's also a mono version. So a little bit different here, of course, with our TMT or tolerance modeling technology, because it's just one channel instead of two channels on the stereo, of course. And the our meters down here for the expander and the limiter. All right, so let's go ahead and hop in here and see how these things work. Okay, so let's start up here at the top with our filters. So before we actually hear that on the SSL, let's look at it visually here on this plugin. So those who don't know what a filter does or what filters do, they can actually just see it visually. Okay, so let me go ahead and turn this one on. So right here you can see HPF, so high pass filter. So in a high pass filter, the highs pass, which means you're filtering out the low end, as you can visually see there. Over here is our LPF, or low pass filter, and that's going to filter out the top end and let the lows pass. Okay, so this is visually what's going to go on with these two knobs right here. So if I had a setting on our high pass filter on the SSL at 862 hertz, so actually let me just take this off for now, and I had it at say 252 hertz, it would look essentially kind of like that. Okay, same thing here for the top end. If I was filtering out somewhere up to, say, 9K, then that would look about like that or so. Okay, right up here. So why do we use filters? We use filters to filter out unneeded energy or unneeded data or unneeded sound from each, from each source. So for example, if you have a guitar, a bass, and a kick drum, you probably don't need a ton of low end in that guitar because it's going to start to sound a little bit muddy, and it's not going to pop out as much with that, combined with the low end energy of the bass and the kick drum. So you can, of course, filter out, say, low end on a guitar, or low end on a vocal, or low end on anything that you don't need. Same thing for the top end. If you have a harsh guitar, you might want to filter out some of that top end, or if there's energy in any track where you don't need the top end, you can use your low pass filter and dial that out. So here's the track without anything on it, no filters at all. So let's go ahead and pop this back on. And now we'll filter out some low end there. And top end. So you can hear and you can see how we're just choosing the frequencies of that track that we want to pop through. All right, so let's head over here now to the SSL desk, and you'll see it works literally exactly the same way. We just don't have the graphical display. So first up, you have to turn your filters on. So just click the red button right there. Now it's on, now it's off. So if I dial in a setting here, we'll turn it on. I could turn it off. You You can turn it on and off and check real quick, check your settings. You can also double click these knobs and that will turn on that filter for you. You can also use your mouse wheel on all of these parameters to scroll around if you don't just want to grab it with the mouse. All right, so that's what our high pass and low pass filters are going to do here. Now we have these buttons up here that say ×3 and divided by 3, and that just extends the range of our filters. So by default on our HPF, our high pass filter, we can only go up to 350 Hertz. But if that's not enough, if there's other, there's more low end a little bit higher up, and we need to filter that out, we can do the ×3 here. And now that takes us from 48 Hertz up to 1050 Hertz versus the 350 that we had previously. Same thing for the top end here, just divided by 3. So by default, it's going from 22 Hertz down to 3K. If we do our divided by 3, we can go from 7.3 Hertz to 1K. All right, so it just gives you a wider range, okay? All right, so that is how your filters work, the basics of filters for those who didn't know. And now we'll move on to our DYN SC, or dynamic sidechain. And what is the dynamic sidechain? Well, a dynamic sidechain is essentially the signal that's going to control our compressor or our dynamic section. Now, our dynamic section is the compressor and the expander here. We can turn the dynamic section on or off right there. Right now, we have, well, let's actually hear this here. All right. So now we'll go ahead and turn it on, and we have a setting already right here where we're pulling out some of that low end and filtering out some of the top end. So of course we know what that sounds like. But if I put this in the dynamic sidechain, now look what happens. Something completely different, right? Again, let me take this off and just pull our filters out here, or I could just turn them off. Now watch what happens to this compressor, especially when that kick starts to hit. Look over here at your meter here on our limiter compressor meter. You can see how the compressor is being triggered with the kick, with the snare. But if I dial out some of that low end, and let's actually just listen to it here. Maybe a little top end too, and put this sound here into the dynamic sidechain. Now watch what happens to the compressor. So it's really a lot more active now whenever that snare hits. The snare is a little more present, the kick is a little more present versus this here. All right, now if you want to see this in a different way, we can check another plugin here that's included with Pro Tools in this case here. So what we have here is our high filter and our low filter. We already know what those do, but we can listen to the side chain right here. And again, that side chain is what's going to control whenever the compressor hits, obviously based on our threshold and our ratio. So if we hear that, so now we're listening to the side chain. And again, the side chain is the audio signal that's controlling our compressor here. All right. So that is the signal now that's going to be triggering the compressor. Just take that off of listen to the sidechain and actually hear the compressor now. So obviously much different than if we didn't have that. Okay, now why would you want to do this? Well, again, just like our filters, by sending our filters to the dynamic sidechain, we're able to control the signals or the frequencies that essentially our compressor is going to see and react to. So just like in our example here, if we didn't want the low end of the kick drum triggering the compressor, we can shape the signal in the sidechain with our filters, go ahead and send that to the sidechain. And that way what the compressor sees and reacts to is going to be just those frequencies that we want. We can get sort of a different sound and a different feel for our compression. You can also do effects like say you want like a telephone style effect. So just hear this track real quick.
Can't stop to think and say.
All right. So if we want to make that more telephone-like, we can dial out some of that low end, filter it out. A bit of the top end here. Take this off here. A bit of the top end there too. We're going to come to this mid right here, and we're going to pump that up a bit and then compress it. And we should have sort of a telephony style sound now.
Can't stop to think and say, stay away, oh stay away.
All right.
Can't stop to think and say.
All right, so that is our filters here on the SSL consoles. All right, so let's go ahead and look at our dynamics section. We're going to start with the compressor. And as we can see here, let's just look at this audio waveform. So right here is a track with no compression. And then here's a track, the same track that has been compressed, compressed quite a bit, as you can tell. It's basically been limited actually here at the top end because it's been pretty much just chopped off. And compression and limiting are very similar. Usually a setting of 10 to 1 or 20 to 1, depending on who you ask, is usually considered limiting. And we can do limiting on the SSL consoles. Right, you can just take this all the way up, and now we are in limiter mode, and that's why on our meter down here it says LC. That's limiter compressor for our reduction meter right there. Okay, so again, as you can see here, here's a track with a lot of energy here, then it goes down in energy or level, and it comes back up and it goes back down. So after compression, you can see the differences in the peaks are much different, right? This quieter section is much louder because we applied makeup gain, and this louder section ends up being quieter. So in some ways, compression is almost like adjusting the volume on your track. Now, it's not exactly the same thing. Some people say it is, it's actually not, because especially with the SSL, in analog modeled compressors, these things are modeled after hardware, and they're going to react differently. They're going to have their own sound and characteristics and tone. But if you want to think of it as lowering the volume and raising the volume, you can think of it like that. So real quick, for those who don't know about compression, let's listen to this non-compressed track first. In the quiet section. Then it gets really loud. So after that was compressed, now this is overly compressed, mind you, but you can definitely tell the difference here in the level changes. Right, much less of a difference. All right, so what is compression? Why do we use compression? Well, compression is used to, and limiting also, is used to reduce the dynamic range. And by dynamic range, I mean the difference between the quietest part and the loudest part of your track. So you set a threshold and a ratio, and whenever your signal goes over that threshold, it's going to be reduced by whatever your ratio happens to be. So an example would be if the quietest part of your track is say minus 30 dB and the loudest part of your track is minus 10 dB, that would be a 20 dB dynamic range. Okay. If we then set let's grab a desk here. If we then set a threshold of say, minus 20 and a ratio of 2 to 1, well, we know our peak of minus 10 is going to go 10 dB over our minus 20 setting because we have a minus 10. It's going to go, 10 dB over our setting there, right? So that's going to be reduced by our ratio of 2 to 1, which means instead of having a dynamic range now of 20 dB, it's going to be a dynamic range of 15 dB. So if our minus 10 signal is going over our minus 20 threshold, that means it's 10 dB over. It's reduced by 2 to 1. That means it's only going to go up 5 dB instead of 10 dB. So that's how we arrive at that number, that it reduced the dynamic range. Of course, higher settings is going to be reduced even more. And that's why once you get up to 50 to 1, it's only going like a decimal over. And we can go up here to limiting, which will give you basically a hard cap, essentially. Depends on the limiter, actually. But it will really limit, as you can see here, this is basically limited here because we don't really have a dynamic range in this section here at all versus this here. As you can tell, everything has been pulled down and just completely limited. So let's look at this real quick on a different plugin. just so you can get an idea of how it works. It's usually easier if you don't know about these things to see them visually, right? So we have a ratio, which you can see right up here. That's the ratio of the reduction. Don't worry about the release time or the attack time right now. And here's our threshold, okay? So any signal that goes over the threshold will be reduced by our ratio amount. Now, of course, once we reduce the level, it's going to be quieter, and that's where makeup gain comes in. Now, keep in mind, when it comes to these SSL desks, they have automatic gain. So that's why you don't see a gain knob here like you're going to see on some other compressors, because it automatically applies that makeup gain for you based on your settings of your threshold and your ratio. All right, so you don't have to worry about it with that. But as an example here, let's play back this track here. You see this little red ball, right? Let's pull our threshold way up here. So right now, essentially, we're having no compression because our signal is not going over the the threshold. We can hear the difference in the level in that track. So now let's pull our threshold down so we make sure we're compressing in this area here. All right, that's a pretty good setting. We don't want to compress too much in this area because it's already pretty good. Now we'll mess with our ratio, or the amount of reduction. As you can see, of course, the further I go down, the more it's obviously pulling out. And also you can see when I come down here to 100 to 1, you can see how flat this line is. So that is essentially limiting. Again, look at this here. Look at a setting of 4 to 1. You can see there's still dynamic range in there that we can achieve at this compression setting. But up here to 100 to 1, there's nothing, right? It's just limiting that signal. All right. So we can do that on our SSLs there as well by taking that all the way up to infinity. So let's go ahead and set this up, and we'll try to get these two sections a bit more even. See the gain reduction here? Okay. But of course, again, like I said, our signal is now quieter. So what do? We make up for the reduction with makeup gain. All right, so we're going to raise that back up about to where it was. And now you'll notice that after we applied that makeup gain, these two sections sound much more even. Well, that's because, again, this area here is being compressed. This area here is not really being compressed. But because we raised the overall level, we reduced the dynamic range in this area, we didn't reduce it in this area, and then we raised the overall level. So we can bring everything up to make everything sound a bit more even. So that's usually why you're using compression, to sort of even things out so things aren't too loud here and too quiet there. Even things out, make them sound, give them a certain tone, make them sound bigger, make them sound fatter. There's a lot of uses for compression, but one of the most basic ones is to sort of level things out, right? You can't have a bass guitar with really quiet notes and then really loud notes and then really quiet notes. It's going to be impossible to mix. So you could use some compression on that to even out those notes. Of course, use compression on your master bus as well to sort of bring everything together and glue everything together as well. All right, so that is just a look at compression visually before we get to it there on the SSL. And real quick, we'll look here at another plugin real quick, just so you can see this visually. So let's play this back. Or you can easily see what's happening here with this threshold line right here. If I just play back, no compression because we're not going over the threshold. But if I pull down here to make sure we're grabbing those peaks, now we're getting this reduction right here on those peaks, of course, based on our ratio there. And then it sounds quieter overall, so we add in makeup gain. But we do have a feature on this compressor where we could just do automatic makeup gain, just like we have in the SSL. All right. And this here is a look at a limiter. So a limiter is, again, just going to put a cap on something. Now, limiters are going to work different. Some of them, you're going to pull something, you're going to pull one side down, and the overall output's going to go up. On this limiter, we're just looking at placing a cap on the overall level. So you can see I can really jack that gain up there. Doesn't matter. It's not going to go over that level with this limiter. All right, so limiting and compression are very similar things. Just see that visually. All right, so we'll look at compression here now on our SSL desk. We'll use the G. It's going to work the same way on the E. Of course, first make sure I have my dynamics section on, and on the G we can switch to the E, and on the E we can switch to the G unit. They're going to sound slightly different, so you're just going to have to play around with them and see which ones you like best. So let's go ahead and hear this bass. So you can tell that on these longer notes that are sustained, the attack isn't nearly as high in level as those shorter plucks, right? So we're going to use compression to even that out. Go ahead and turn our desk on. Let's go ahead and find our threshold that we need. Okay. All right, so that's a little bit more even. Bypass that. Turn it back on. So now these sustained notes are coming through better. They sound thicker. They sound bigger. The overall track sounds bigger overall with compression on it. Much more even overall. Now, right here, this button right here is for a fast attack. So it's an auto attack by default and a fast attack. So again, just the attack is how quickly do you want the compression to start after it goes over your threshold, okay? If we have a fast attack, it's not really going to work here on this bass, but we can hear it. Pulling a little too much out, I think, because what's happening is it's triggering the compressor here and it's immediately pulling it down. Whereas on this slightly slower attack, it's letting that transient through a little bit more. So, it's going to depend on your program material on which setting that you use. A little more attack there. Kind of like that a little better. But that is your fast attack there. Then we have our release right here. And the release is just how quickly is the compressor going to release the signal after it falls below that threshold, right? Is it going to hold on to that signal for a while? Or is it going to, just completely release it as soon as it goes underneath that threshold? We can see that. Let's see that visually real quick here. Pull this up here, and we'll just play this back with this compressor. There we go. Pull up our gain a bit. Okay. We got a really fast attack. It's really attacking that quickly, as you can see. Or a slower attack. So now you can see that gain reduction isn't really even happening here. Make it a bit quicker. And then for the release it really quick. Or hold on to it. So you can see what's happening now here to the gain reduction. Really holding on for a while, even after it falls below the threshold. Versus this, it's going to pump on and pump off really quick. All right, so that is what those settings do in a visual look there. So we'll move on to this example right here. So let's play this back. All right, now let's go ahead and compress this up. All right. Do a fast attack if we want. All right. Fast release, slow release. But here we have a mix knob, as you can see right there. This little screw, just click it and drag it, or of course use your mouse wheel. And what this allows us to do is dial in compression, so we can really overly compress something to get the tone, the character, and sort of the evenness, and then also keep our dynamic range while just dialing in, a certain amount. So essentially what it is parallel compression, okay? You might do this a lot on drums, or some people might do it on an entire mix, have a really compressed version of their mix, and then just dial in, you know, that compressed version with their more dynamic version. And it makes everything sound bigger and badder, and, you know, just comes through a lot more. So let's pump this up to 100% right now. And I'm going to compress this again. Really compress it. Overly compress it. So it's really smacking right now. So we're really getting more attack, especially out of that snare right now. But now I'm going to pull the mix down so we get more of the dynamics, but we still get the power of that compression, just blended in a bit. That's off. All the way on. And pull it down about there. All right, so that is your mix knob on your compressor as well. Again, use that for things like parallel compression and things like that. All right, back up here to the bass real quick. We also have a HPF or high pass filter built right into the compressor. We actually had it on during our bass example. So again, our high pass filter, we sort of saw that whenever we sent our filters to the side chain, right? So if all you want to do is dial out some low end from hitting your compressor, right, and triggering that compression, you can just use a high pass filter. You wouldn't have to actually send your, you know, both of the filters to your dynamic side chain, right? Use this if you, again, if you want to sort of, you know, filter out and decide what, you know, frequency ranges are going to be triggering your compressor. But if it's just the low end, we can use our high pass filter, which is, you know, built in right there. So again, to see that, let's play back here. Just so you can see, look down here at how much compression is happening here. Really dial it up. So quite a bit, right? But if I start pulling out the low end here with our high pass filter, I'll pull out a bunch. Now we're not actually getting any compression there, because we've dialed out the low end, and the bass is pretty much all low end. We've dialed it all out. So now that signal that would, you know, trigger the compressor just isn't present enough. All right. So that low end again is really triggering the compressor a little too much. I'm going to dial out a bit, and things are going to come through a little bit better now. Yeah, it's better. All right. So there is your high pass filter that's built directly in to your compressor there as well. Let's move on now to the release to knob. Okay. So again, our release is going to dictate how quickly the compressor essentially stops compressing after it goes below that, you know, that threshold. If we saw that up here, just real quick, on this compressor, we'll put a short release here. You can see that right here. We're going to have a really short release, really short. Pull this down a bit more. Then we'll have a long release. And look what happens. So again, you can visually see, look at this release here. Long release right there versus a very short release. Right there, that release right there. All right, because it fell, you know, below the threshold. All right, so visually, that's what your release is gonna look like. Let's come back here, and I'll bypass this for now, just to hear this piano track. So a very dynamic track, right? Let's go ahead and compress it some. So what if we had a really fast release on that? What's going to happen, you think? Let's just jack this up to really exaggerate this effect. You hear that? After this transient here, with this really fast release, it's going to grab it real quick, but then we release really quick, and then the compression releases and the volume comes up. So we have a bit of a pumping effect, right? It compresses down and then falls below the threshold, and then the volume comes back up. So that's, you know, called pumping. In you know, EDM or electronic music, pumping might be desired, but on a piano track, it's probably not what you want. So hear that? Listen right here. not what we want. So then we can pull that release up. Much better. But if we're still going to get pumping, or we're getting too much of the a little too much compression there by holding onto the compression for too long. So we have a little bit of pumping there. Right. So in that case, we have the rel 2 or the release 2. And essentially what we can do is add like an offset to that by percentage there. So down here on 0%, let me just pull this down a bit. Comes up a bit. So we'll pull in sort of a ratio there, percentage, to sort of have a fade of our release time here. Yeah, you can see that there. That's much better. I had that off again. Did you hear that come back up? Right, so of course, adjust your release, but if you're still getting a bit of pumping on the perfect release setting, you have your release 2 to really dial that in, okay? So right now, with this link turned off, you can see we have 2 meters down here for our limiter compressor. So if I play this back, you can see what's happening here on our meters. Right, one side is being compressed way more than the other one because one side is way louder than the other side. Okay, you'll see that up here in our meters as well. You can see how the ratio, the difference, between our volumes of each side is constantly changing because the compression, again, is affecting each side differently. But if we turn link on, you'll see that this meter now collapses down to just one gain reduction meter. And now we're going to get the same compression applied to both sides, as you can see. And our ratio of the difference stays exactly the same, as you can see there. So that is what your link is for. That's going to be up to you to decide if you want to link it or if you want to treat each side differently there with your compression. All right, on to our expander and our gate. So down here on each of the desks, we have an expander gate. Okay, that's part of the dynamic section. Again, you can turn that on or off right here. That turns off both your compressor and your expander. You can switch again right here to the E unit or the G unit right there. All right, again, same thing for both desks. Now, what is an expander gate? Okay, we have that switch right here, gate or expansion. So if you think of compression, which we just looked at, right? So expansion you can think of as an upside down compressor, okay? And a gate you can think of as an upside down limiter. So why is it called an expander? Well, an expander expands the dynamic range. Now that doesn't mean it makes it louder. You got to keep in mind that when I say dynamic range, that really has nothing to do with volume necessarily. Dynamic range is just the difference between the quietest part and the loudest part in your track. So something might have a very small dynamic range, say something that's just low level noise, say minus 65 to minus 60. Well, that's a very small dynamic range, only 5 dB, but it's also very quiet, right? There's a huge difference. I mean, you can also have a dynamic range with a loud volume. So something could be at minus 10 and minus 5. Well, again, that's still a 5 dB dynamic range, but it tells me nothing about the overall volume. So just keep that in mind because it can get sort of confusing when you start saying dynamic range, and some people think that makes it louder. That doesn't make it louder, okay? So what an expander does is it expands the dynamic range, whereas a compressor compresses the dynamic range or reduces the dynamic range. So here we have a compressor, and we know about our threshold there. So whenever a signal here ends up going over that threshold, it gets compressed, right? But over here is our expander. So now look at our threshold, okay? Whenever it falls below the threshold, it gets expanded or gated off depending on what you're using. So it's above, and now it's below the threshold, so now it's expanding, as you can see, okay? If this was, pull our ratio way up, you can sort of see now how it would be on a gate. You can see how that just cuts it off. Just like if we were on a limiter over here, you can see that's just going to go ahead and cut it off. So that's what I mean by an upside down limiter or an upside down compressor. So that's a good visual, a visual look at that. So it's either on, So here's a gate, as you can tell. It's just cut off completely. If instead we had a ratio, so it's kind of like an expander, you can still hear some audio. You can see the gain reduction there. Okay. So let's go ahead and hear maybe one reason why we might use an expander or a gate. And let's go ahead and play back these 2 tracks here. So on this kick track, we're hearing bleed from a snare, from the cymbals, and maybe you don't want that. Maybe you want to clean that up. So that's one reason why you might use something like an expander or a gate. You know, just sort of depends. A gate is usually going to be a bit harsher, so we use gates a lot of times. On something like this, I might use a gate. If you're doing a podcast and you want to sort of lower the volume when you're not near the mic or you're not speaking, you might want to choose an expander instead of a gate, if you can. You don't necessarily have to. It's just, it'll be a little gentler on your audio and it won't clamp down so quickly. Of course, depends on the settings that your gate has. But let's look at this here. Let's turn our range down. So again, the range is the amount of expansion. You can see, even with no audio playing, if I turn this up, it's going to go ahead and start expanding or increasing the dynamic range, which means pulling level down that's below the threshold. Okay. So let's go ahead and try to clean up this track and pull out some of that snare. Again, just go for this section right here. If I bypass it, now with it being expanded, you can hear that. Now with the gate, it's just closed off, which that's probably what we want here. Now we also have an invert. And what invert lets you do is invert can kind of help you tune your gate. There's also uses for it as well. But if you're trying to dial in your gate, you might want to, or your expander, of course, you might want to invert the signal. And now, instead of hearing the signal that's getting through the gate, we're hearing the signal that's going to be gated. So let's look at this here on these kicks. That's with it inverted. So if it wasn't inverted, right, we're actually hearing the kick. But inverted, of course, now we're only hearing the part that's going to be gated. So we can dial that in a bit better. I just want to hear mostly that snare. So now with this setting here, we'll leave our release about there. Yeah, we pulled it down pretty good. So now once we combined our 2 drum tracks together, our kick drum has been cleaned up, and now it can shine through a bit more. Okay, so that's one reason why you might want to expand right there. Now, what about our, our fast attack here? Well, we can, let me squeeze this down a bit. Let's just hear the kick drum. Do a fast attack on that. Go to a gate on that. Let's invert it here. Then we'll hear a fast attack. Right. What about our release? So we can have a really quick release or a longer release. So as you can tell, it's holding it much longer. So that wasn't to sound good. That was just to sort of show how those controls work. All right. So let's go on to our hysteresis control. And let's look at it here in a different plugin first. So essentially what this is going to allow us to do is set a dedicated open and close, sort of a range. So we're not going to get like chattering if you're using the gate. Because as the level falls down right below that threshold, if it's really close to the threshold on your gate, it might start, opening and closing and give you, a bit of chattering here. So let me solo that and hear this here. So we can see what the gate, we can visually see what the gate is doing there. It's just clamping off in between, these areas right here. So we have all that noise in there. Okay. And if we had a long release on that, you'll visually see in here, of course, what that does. Right, it's taking much longer there for that to release and to come on, or to, you know, actually expand, versus very quickly. Or just cutting off. Same thing for the attack. If it's a really long attack here, you can hear right there. Yeah, it's not going to work here, of course. Very fast. Just going to open, close, right? Just going to open real quick. Fast release, you know, it's opening and closing really quick. So again, you just use these knobs here, or these, you know, these settings, of course, on your desk here, your range, your threshold, or your, you know, in our case, we don't have a knob for attack, but we do have the fast attack here. Then we have the release setting right there. So the other thing I wanted to look at was what's called hysteresis. Again, this is going to help us not chatter whenever the gate starts to close. So if we look at this part of the track towards the end here, so it starts to fade down. We get that nastiness there as it's fading down. I sort of pull this up out here. Get sort of a chattering if you're really close to the level that it's, you know, going to fall under to, you know, start to gate off. As you can see, it's reducing, it's not reducing, it's reducing, it's not reducing. Right, we're getting a chattering sound. So that is what our hysteresis or a dedicated close is for. It's going to give you more of a bit of a range for a dedicated close. So you shouldn't get as much chattering now. So let's pull this down. All right, so that's better already. Now it's falling below our threshold. And instead of chattering, there we go. Now it actually stops, okay? So that is what that hysteresis control is for right here on your gate as well. Right there, you can dial in a dedicated close up to minus 25 dB, okay? Lower than this threshold here. And that's only on the gate, by the way. We don't have that with expansion because, of course, expansion already has, you know, a range, as we saw with our other plugins up here, if you remember. This is more of like an expansion here, whereas that's more of like a gate, just getting cut off. It comes below this threshold right here, gets cut off. Essentially, is going to be our gate. Of course, with our hysteresis, we have a range in there, you know, sort of a fade out period. Whereas on our expander, it's going to be a bit softer. You can see that here with this gate and expander too. There's our gate, and there's the expansion. Okay. So again, think of your expander as an upside down compressor, and your gate as an upside down limiter. So we'll play here. So right there, getting some chattering on that gate. Use this, hopefully reduce that. There we go. That's better. All right. So that's what that control is for. All right. And I'm assuming you already know what the range is, but we can look at that one more time here. I'm going to pull this down. Look at this beginning part here. So if I just pulled out a few dB here, you can still hear the noise in between those phrases. Whereas if I really pull out a large range, it's cutting it off. Okay, that's with your expander or your gate. You see how the gate or the expander is a little bit softer than the gate. So that is our expander and gate. Now let's check out these buttons down here at the bottom of our dynamics section. We should already know that the DYN or dynamics button that turns your dynamics section on or off. So of course you can always, you know, check your settings here. A/B them really quick. So again, we're using our gate here. Just turn that off. And again, that affects the expander and our limiter compressor. All right. So you have some settings that, you know, that you set up. You can A/B that real quick, just testing it on and off. Okay. And the next button switches our dynamics section. So here on the E desk, we can switch to the G dynamic section, the compressor limiter and expander gate. And on the G unit, we can switch between the E and the G. Okay, they're both going to sound a little bit different because they're of course modeled on, different hardware. But you can always switch those out depending on what you like for your actual program material. And then we come around to this button here that says key. So dynamics to key. What does that mean? Well, if we look up here, you're going to see a key. Okay, now this might be in a different place depending on what DAW you're using, but there's no key input right now. So you can use this drop down, and we can use another input or a key input to trigger the compressor. Okay, so you remember how we sent our filters to the dynamic sidechain, right? Well, we can use a different audio signal to trigger compression instead of using the signal that's actually playing through the compressor. All right, that's what our key input here is going to do. So let's go ahead and check that out on this drum track right here. So we have a kick, then here we have a bass right there. So let's go ahead and just play this back. So these are two low-end instruments, and you can tell that the bass and the kick, they're sort of, creating this muddiness together. So what we can do then is use a different, and you'll actually see this done a lot. We're going to use the kick signal to actually trigger compression on the bass, okay? And that's going to open up some space for the kick to come through. So let's come to this desk here. Now we could just try to compress the bass signal, right? So if we just compress just the bass with no key. So we can see that on each pluck of the bass, you can see how the compressor is reacting right here, right? All right, so now let's go ahead and instead use our kick to trigger the compressor on our bass, okay? We're not altering the volume of the kick. We're not, we're not going to hear the kick in the bass track. We're just using this audio to trigger the compressor. That's all we're doing, okay? You turn the desk back on here. Now you don't technically have to have a desk on, your track that you're going to use for your key input. I just have it on there because I like the settings that we have set up here. Okay. So what we need to do, at least here in Pro Tools, to create our input here for our key, as you can see, I already have it set up. Up here is our key, drop down. I'm going to use bus 3, and that's because I already set it up right here. I created a send. If you don't see your send, you can just use this drop down right here and show your sends right there. Or of course, you can do that over here in your mix view as well if you prefer. So I went ahead and set up a send here and make sure I actually turn it on. And you'll probably want to put your send on pre. So that way your changes over here, if you end up muting something, it's actually not going to mute the send as well. All right, so I have this set on pre. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but that's how you set up your send here in Pro Tools. So what we're doing, again, for those who don't know, we're sending the kick out of this send. Then on this desk, on the bass track, right here, so this is on this track, come up here to your key input, use your drop down, and I'm going to choose bus 3 because that's the same bus that we used. Now to actually have the kick track trigger compression on our bass track, we need to turn on the key on the Dynamics 2 right there. Okay, that's all there is to it. So now let's watch what happens. Let's solo both of those tracks. So now let's watch how this compressor responds once we have the key input triggering compression. So again, look over here at our reduction meter. Let's take the key off. Now watch what happens. You see how we're getting that reduction every single time a bass note is hit. Okay, that's because our bass audio is triggering the compressor and going over the threshold, and of course, making our reduction, okay? So with the key input, then watch every time our kick hits, then we get compression right in these areas here, and not every time we get a bass note, all right? And listen to what it does to the audio. It actually opens it up and makes that kick drum stand out a little bit more. So we'll see this down here. Now we'll listen to these two tracks. Let me bypass these desks for now and listen to this. All right, so underneath here, we just have just this straight synth part, right? But we have a send already on this track, just like we did, remember, with this other kick track. So we're going to use this track here to start triggering this track here. All right. And we're going to trigger our, this time, gate. Okay. So let's hear that. So what's happening here, right? Again, we have our key input, which of course, again, is this track here. I have the send set up here in Pro Tools. It might be different in whatever DAW you're using. But again, this track here is going to trigger the expander and the compressor. We can use both together, of course. But in our case, what we're doing is we're triggering with our kick when we hear this lower sort of synth sound. So essentially, you're not going to hear our synth in this area, right? Because it's gated out. But once it gets here, the gate opens up on our synth track, right? Because we're using this track to control this track, the expander on this track. So it breaks open the gate here, and then you hear both of them at the same time. So it sort of fills out that low end here on our kick. So that's another thing that you can do. You can just have a very low sort of a sub sound and use your key input to trigger that sub sound every time it's like a kick hits or something like that, right? Of course, make sure our threshold is up. Of course, if I turn the range down, we're not going to get the reduction. Go and turn it up. With that long release, it's almost like having an 808 hit or something, right? Because that, that gate is closing much slower now. Where that is just, coming on and off. If I inverted that, let me get the opposite, right? Now it's creating some sort of a sequence for that otherwise static track. Which can also be kind of cool to do. This time we're going to use a vocal track. In this case, it's dialogue, but it could be singing, right? You could use your vocal for your song, of course, underneath or on top of your music, right? And then you could have your vocal sort of duck down all the music underneath it. But in this case, we're going to do it as dialogue, which will happen, which you'll hear all the time happen in voiceover and things like that. Somebody starts talking and all of a sudden the volume of the backing track goes down, right? That's essentially called ducking. Of course, we could do that with volume automation, but we can also do it with compression in our key input. So here's an example here. Let's just hear these two tracks together. Let me make sure that's bypassed.
Go on now. How's everything, Chip? If I was any better, it'd be a sin. Tip of the cat, welcome. I don't care. I don't care.
You hear this area right here? It's I can't hear the vocal very good, right? So I need to turn down my backing track, but I can do that automatically by using our key input there for, in this case, we could do compression, but we're actually going to do expansion, and this time we're going to invert it. So again, our key input here is 5 because I've created a send here on the vocal track right here. Here's my send. I'm sending this audio into this key input for this track here. So every time we get, somebody speaking, it's going to trigger our compressor or trigger our expander in this case, and it's going to duck that audio down underneath, right underneath the vocal, and it's going to rise back up in these spaces here. Okay, so let's hear what that actually sounds like. Have this turned on, we have it set up, and let's just play.
Go on now.
See that expansion right there?
How's everything, Chip?
Ducks it
down.
If I was
any better, it'd be a sin. Tip of the cat, welcome.
Rises up.
I don't care.
Ducks it down.
I don't care.
My jokes don't go over, I don't care. Everybody! One more time! Ah! We hate you, I don't care! Zoom, zoom, zoom! Bing, bing, bing!
And it comes back up. Okay, so if I didn't have the key input on for this track here, and I was just using the expander inverted, it's not going to rise up in the in these spaces.
One more time! Ah!
It's just holding it at that level, right? But I don't want that. I don't want it held at that level. So that's why I'm using the key input to make sure that it comes back up.
One more time! Ah!
If this was normal, then we're going to get the opposite action.
We hate you, I don't care!
So now the track is, of course, expanded. And then once the gate opens with this track, then the volume of this track rises up. Okay, because it's breaking through the gate, just like we did, previously there. So that's why we're inverting it. So that way, whenever this track plays, it's sort of compressing it down. Now, again, like I said, we could use compression with this, but I actually like the sound of the expander better, and it works better for what I want here. Now we can combine this with compression, and that can sort of duck things down a little bit more. But you might want to set things up like this here with your expander if you want to try some ducking, really easy ducking.
Yeah, word is bond. Word is bond.
Right, so one thing you also want to be careful of, just as we've already discussed, is your release time, your fast attack time. So if my release is too quick here, in these little spaces where Chip isn't saying anything,
yeah, word is bond. Word is
comes up too fast. So that's why we're pulling our release up here. So that way it holds it a little bit longer. And also, we're not using a gate. It's not going to sound that good with a gate.
Yeah, word is bond. Word is bond.
Yeah. Expander is just better. It's a little softer.
Yeah, word is bond. Word is bond.
We get a nice rise up there, which is much, much better.
I make love to you with my heart.
Looking good, Chip.
Yeah, you know how it is.
Wow. You are so damaged.
This is stupid!
The truth is that you're a sick, twisted man.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay, so that is a look at ducking using our key input and our expander. Pretty easy, pretty simple to set up there. If you want some of that automatic ducking, again, if you have a dialogue track or even a vocal track, whatever, and your music bed is just a little too loud, or you need to duck it out of the way every time you start speaking, this is how you can set it up. Of course, again, dynamics, make sure you have the key, find the track that you want to trigger. Okay, so this track, I want to trigger this track. So I, of course, set my send up on this track here. So I'm sending this audio into the console that's on this track. Make sense? Right there. So let's move on to some other things you can do, because there's a lot of stuff you can do by sending your dynamics to the sidechain there. So here we have a voice, and we have drums right here. Let me bypass that for now and just hear this here. So here's just the voice. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this drum track to create sort of a sequence with her vocals. So make sure I turn my desk on here, of course. I already have my key input set up. You know, I have it going through 7, so I have the input here on 7, of course, and I have that triggered right in here. So now we're going to use this track to trigger sort of a sequence or melody in our vocal track. So in this case, we're using a gate, and we're having it in normal mode. We're expanding it quite a bit, really pulling that level down, and you know, again, creating that sort of jittering, stuttering effect. Every time these sort of lower level sounds where the gate would close, where they're, you know, again, sort of triggering the gate to close, that's when we're getting that sequenced sound, and we're not getting it on the kicks there. We're also compressing, again, keep in mind that the key input to the dynamics triggers both the compressor and the expander. And you can of course use those together. And you can also send your filters to the dynamic sidechain as well at the same time. And, use your filters to sort of control the frequencies that, again, are triggering that, that compressor. So if I wanted the kicks to trigger that, let me pull this up here. So now whenever the kicks hit, that's when we're getting the sound of her voice coming through. So that is the entire dynamics section. That's the entire side here. Our filters, our compressor, our expander, which again, those two are the dynamics section. Switch your E or G again on both, and your key input. All right, so let's move on to the EQ now. All right, so here we have the E desk and here we have the G desk, and you can tell that the EQs are laid out about the same, but they're slightly different. Over here, we have the brown and the black, and the filter shapes are going to be different on these, by the way. Also, the gain ranges will be different. And over here, we have what's called the pink and the orange, and the orange should be anyway. At least it is classically. It is sort of a different take on the brown, essentially. In general, again, you're just going to have to try these desks on your audio source and see which works better for you. Some people prefer the sound of the E, some prefer the sound of the G. The G is said to have maybe more of a mid-rangey sort of a punch to it, perhaps. It also has more travel in the gain for the EQ. So for example, in our high mid filter, I can take that up to plus 20 dB, whereas over here on the E, I'm going to plus 15 or minus 15. And if I change my EQ type over here, I actually get plus 22 or minus 22, where again over here, it's just minus 15 or plus 15. So we have a larger range over here on the G. Plus some of the G units had what's called like proportional cues. So like the higher you went up, it would like tighten up, or the lower you went down, it would tighten down a little bit, whereas it would stay the same on a lot of the E units, okay? So most people have used an EQ at least once in their life, even if it wasn't like a professional EQ. It could have been, an EQ in your car, or an EQ on a radio or a stereo or something. So EQ, of course, short for equalizer. And equalizer essentially means that we're equalizing all of the levels of different frequency ranges in our, each track, or maybe the entire song. So you can almost think of an EQ as volume knobs for different ranges. Sort of think of it like that. So if there's a sound, a level, whatever, sticking out around 2K, but say, come down here, make sure this band is on. But let's say around, 400 hertz, it's, the level's fine. Well, of course, I might want to pull down the level in this area, but leave this area up. Whereas if I just turn down the volume on everything, well, everything goes down, okay? So again, your EQ kind of like volume knobs for each, different frequency band or frequency range. So over here on the E, we have a shelf. Now, what is a shelf EQ? Well, let's go ahead and look at it here. Turn that on. So right here is what's called a shelf EQ, and you can see how it raises all of those frequencies right there. Let's go ahead and just check that out so you can hear the difference between a shelf and a bell. So using our shelf, I can of course pull out a lot of low end by using the shelf. But over here, as you can see, we can change this to a bell shape. Now a bell shape is going to look like that. It looks like a bell, okay? Now on our desk, we can't change the cue size. Over here we can. So if we say our bell was that wide and we hear that, that's going to be much different, right, than the shelf. And by the way, some shelves, are different. Some shelves have a little resonant boost. Some have like a pre-boost dip, and that's why different EQs sound different. Somebody might be asking, why don't I just use the EQ that you have on screen here? Well, that's because they're going to sound different, right? Because the filter shapes are different, and plus, with the analog modeling, you're modeling all of the components in the signal too, and that's going to make a huge difference to the overall sound. And that's why people use different EQs, because they're not all exactly the same. Over here, we're choosing our frequency range. Now this is the the top filter. Okay, so we're going from 1.5K to 16K. So I should actually turn on this shelf right there so you can see that right there. That's more of what that's like. Now this band down here would be this low end over here that we already saw. Okay, so our shelf, again, here's the volume, so minus 15. That would be like taking this down minus, I can go down minus 12 on this one here, but that's what it would essentially look like. Of course, at say 7.4K, so we'll put this at about 7.4K, and that's kind of what that would look like as a shelf. If I turned it into a bell, kind of look like that. So let's go ahead and move on to our middle two bands here, our HMF, which is the high mid filter, and the LMF, which is the low mid filter. Let me turn off our shelves now that we know what those are. Go ahead and turn on the low mid filter. So our low mid filter and our high mid filter are going to be bells, bell shapes, which is going to look like this here. So again, here's the gain for that, that band, which again would be like this knob here. Are we turning it up or are we cutting some out? This knob here is going to choose your frequency, the one that you're centered around. So between 200 Hertz and 2.5K. So again, it's choosing the frequency that we're trying to find. And then this knob here is our Q factor, or our bandwidth, okay, the size or the width of our Q. Now, if I pull this down here, as you can see, it's a very tight band. As I pull it up here, it's a much wider band. So that would be equivalent to over here, our Q. So very tight, affecting fewer frequencies, or very wide, affecting more frequencies. If I boost this up, a very tight Q, not really affecting that many ranges, right? If I widen it out, of course, you're affecting more of the audio there. All right, so that is what our Q is. That's what your frequency range is, just finding that range that you want to affect, and then you want to boost it or do you want to cut it? All right, and that's the same for basically any EQ out there. All the controls are going to be essentially the same. Of course, the filter types are going to be different, so they're going to sound different. But this is, again, for those who don't know how EQ works, that's how it works. So let's get over here now to the actual desk. Now, again, we have a EQ type, which is going to change. You're just going to see the brown or the black change to brown. Now, keep in mind, it changes the filters for every single band, even though you only see the color change on that one. So it's going to sound different overall. All right. So I'm on that shelf, boosting that low end, turn the EQ off down here. I'm really going to boost this up. I'm going to switch to the brown. So the brown might be a little smoother sounding overall. We give it more low end there. We give it some air on top. Just a bit. So for those who don't know how to EQ, a general way that people would EQ is the boost and twist method. It's usually what it's called. So you'll boost up, quite a good amount, and then you'll just start twisting your knob and trying to find the frequencies that you want. So I might want a wider Q for that. So let's just try that. I'll boost this up. Try to find right there. So that's the range I want to work on, perhaps. So maybe I want to tighten that up and just pull out a little bit of that so it's not as harsh. Okay. So on our high mid filter, we're going from 600 Hertz to 7K. On our low mid, we're going from 200 Hertz to 2.5K. And again, both of those are bells. Choose your bell shape or your bandwidth, Q size, right there. All right. So let's go ahead and move on now to the GEQ. It's, it's going to function the same way essentially. So I'm not really going to go over too much of it here, but it does have some differences. So here on the pink, for example, we can't choose between a shelf and a bell like we can on the E. It's just locked to a shelf on our upper shelf and our lower shelf here, okay? But when we're on the pink, we have these ×3 and divided by 3's buttons, which you probably recognize from the filters right here, right? So what you can do is here on our high mid filter, we can go from 600 hertz to 7K, times that by 3. Now we can go from 1.8K up to 21K. So much higher. You know, if there's a frequency that you just can't get in the standard setting, you know, it goes up to 7K, but you want to pull out 17 dB at 11K. Well, I can't get up there, and I can't turn this to a bell. So let's ×3. Then I can come up here to 8K or 14K or 11K or whatever we want, and go ahead and pull that out by 15 dB with a tight Q. So that's how that works. Again, switch it right here, and then we have our shelf and bell, which you already probably recognize from the E desk that we have. All right. And again, you're going to have to try these different filters out, different EQs out, because they're going to sound a little bit different. And we're going to actually analyze these in just a second. So you're actually going to see the differences here. Let me default this out real quick and play this back. So up here, again, I'm choosing my frequency range. I'm on the shelf. I'm going up high, and I'm pulling in some of that in to bring in some air. I also want more power on the low end. Of course, we're stuck with a shelf, so maybe 152, about 4 more dB on that. So there's definitely a different sound in there. And you also have to keep in mind that whenever we're on the black or the pink EQ here, we have 22 dB of gain, whereas when we're on the orange, we only have 20. So whatever your setting is going to be different, okay, whenever you switch. So you might hear a volume difference and think, oh, well, this EQ sounds better. Well, not necessarily. There's a slight volume difference. There's a phase difference, timing difference, filter differences, of course, but there's also a volume difference. So don't get, sidetracked by that, all right? So for example, if I was at plus 14 dB on this at around 3K and I switch my EQ, well, now I'm actually at plus 13, right? So I've lost the dB just by switching my EQs there. All right, so now let's go ahead and analyze these EQs so we can visually see the differences in them. So I'm going to use a tone generator here, and let's go ahead and pull up the E. So go ahead and turn that on, and we can see exactly what's happening here. So we have the E desk right now, and we just want to see the differences in our, our filters, our filter shapes, and things like that, right? So let's go ahead and start up here on the shelf so you can, again, visually see what happens here. So I'm at 8K with a shelf. I boost it. You can see exactly what happens there with a shelf. I switch that to a bell. You can see that now we have more of a bell shape. It's a pretty wide bell, as we can see. More of a bell shape versus our shelf. Same thing if I pull it down, turn it to a bell, more of a bell shape there. All right, let's go to one of these middle bands here, and let's boost this up. We'll go somewhere around 4K or so. You see what happens there. So right now, again, we have a really wide Q, so we're affecting more frequencies. Okay, so if I cut it 15 dB, I boost it 15 dB, you can see that there. If I tighten this up, let me boost it here. I tighten that up, you can see how that came in, right? So now it's a much tighter Q. As you can see, boost and cut. Now let's go ahead and switch our EQ type. You saw a switch there, a change, right? We had a bit of a difference, even though we're on the same 4K. You can see there's like a phase differences, there's like timing differences. So this is one reason why EQs sound different, because they're not, they're not digital. Analog gear isn't digital, so it's not always exactly one-to-one perfect all the time. And actually, those differences are what make analog gear usually sound so good. Or at least a lot of people like the sound of analog gear, and it's because of those small differences. As you can see, a bit of shift there on that as well as some other differences. As we can see, even sounds different. If you can hear that, just that pink noise. Hear that? Those filters are way different. Really boost that low end. Let's check out the G now. We'll go ahead and make sure we turn that noise off. And go ahead and grab this. And turn that noise on. And go ahead and grab our desk. And go ahead and look at what these filters look like. Pop that up there. All right, so let's check out these EQ filters as well. Here, let me set this on default. So we on the, let's go for the shelf right now. Let's boost it way up at about 3K. So we can see that shelf right there. So we know, you see the play in that shelf is much greater than the one that we had on the E desk. You can see that there. Let's go and switch our type. So you can see that even though we're on shelf here, our shelf filter is different. As you can see on the orange, you can see it comes down a bit around here. Whereas on the pink, it's higher, even way up here in this area here. Let's go to this, say a middle band here, somewhere in here. Have a nice boost, widen it up, tighten it down, up 20 dB. Then we'll hit our EQ type, change it. Boom. Of course, you see a rise in level, and actually it looks like our Q shape is slightly wider. It looks like to me between these two. Like this one here looks a little bit more proportional. Pull that down and change our type again. You can see it widens out actually. And it sort of stays that width almost the entire time. All right, so there are differences in these filters. That's the point of this part here, is to realize that not all EQs are exactly the same. They're different. Depending on the material that's coming through them, they're going to sound different. They're not they're not digital filters. They're not zeros and ones. These EQs and EQs like this are modeled on on analog gear, which of course is going to have differences. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be a digital one-to-one recreation every single time. And that's why, that's why you would use a different EQ, because, I'm sure you've seen online too, people say, well, why not just use the stock EQ in your DAW? Well, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with using the stock EQ in your DAW, but to say that's the only EQ you need, maybe it is for you, but it's not for a lot of people, because EQs sound different, just like compressors sound different, and different models of analog gear sound different. That's why even in big studios that use all analog gear, they don't just have one EQ. They have several different hardware units, because they sound different, because the filters are different, right? And here's a quick look at both EQs at the same time. Our top analyzer is for the E, the bottom here is for the G. So if I make a change here, just look at the changes in that shelf at around 8K. We'll do the same sort of changes here at around 8K. Huge difference, right? Huge difference in that shape. Change the type here for the G, change the type for the E. So of course, differences between these filters. Let's center around 4K in our high mid filter, have a nice boost, make it pretty wide. We'll do the same thing here. We'll come to about 4K, make it wide, and we'll boost it way up. So different for sure. Let's pull the G Q down to a point, this down. As you can see, they are different for sure. Change the type here, change the type here. Again, much different. So all of these EQs are going to have their own sound, their own feel, their own tone. And of course, again, keep in mind on the G, we have a longer or a bigger range of gain. So up to 22 dB, minus 22 dB, whereas over here on the E, we have minus 15 to plus 15. All right, so on to the buttons down here. What do they do? Let's check those out. Playback here. So if I have a large boost in the EQ here in the low end, and I want to turn it off real quick to sort of A/B it back and forth, you can turn your entire EQ off right there. So we're just bypassing the EQ. You can still have your compressor running. your expander running, so on and so forth, okay? So just the EQ right there. Let's hear it in context. All right, I kind of like the boost in low end there. Then over here we have pre-dyne or pre-dynamics. So what this does is it shifts the EQ from being post-dynamics, so post-compressor and expander, and it makes it pre-compressor and expander. That means it's going to EQ the sound first, then it's going to compress it and expand it. Versus the way it's set up by default is everything gets compressed first, and then it gets EQ'd. So which is the correct way? Well, there's no correct way. It just depends on what you want to do, right? Do you want to EQ the sound first, so you know exactly what frequencies are hitting the compressor? Or do you want to go ahead and compress first and then EQ that compressed sound? There's no right or wrong way, right or wrong way to do it, but it will sound different. So I'm getting way too much of a top end on that note there. Let me pull this up here. Okay, put that pre-dynamics. Sounds about the same in this case. But if in this case, let me really crank this here, just so you can see on the reduction meter down here what happens, all right? So make this pre-dynamics and then pull out a lot of low end. So of course, since I pulled out a lot of low end, now it's not really triggering the compressor nearly as much, right? Because the overall level just isn't there. Whereas now it's really triggering the compressor because I've added in 15 dB of low end. So that's your pre-dynamics. Now we also have this familiar button, DYN SC, or dynamic sidechain, and we can send the equalizer to the dynamic sidechain the same way that we can the filters. Okay, so again, this, instead of EQing, the audio itself, we're EQing the signal, just the signal that's going to essentially trigger compression, essentially. Okay. So let's look at an example here. Let me pump this way up, and we'll just, by the way, you can't have both of these on at the same time. It can either be pre-dynamics or you can have it in the sidechain, one of the two, all right? Or of course, both of them off. So let's hear this again. We hear that low end. Now we'll put it in the sidechain. So a different sound for sure. So again, what we're doing with that dynamic sidechain in this case is we're boosting that low end. So that's going to end up triggering the compression more. So you can see that. Right, I can also really boost this top end and make that trigger the compressor more if I wanted to. Right. Okay, so that's one thing that you can do with your dynamic sidechain for your EQ. Again, you're EQing the sound. Essentially, you're EQing the sound that's going to trigger your compressor or expander there. Let's look at this for some way you might actually use this. Although I actually wouldn't do this. I would actually just grab a de-esser, but you can de-ess like this. Okay, let's check it out here. So we'll go ahead and bypass this right now. Just listen to this.
In the evenings we get along. I just want you with me all the.
Hear all of those S sounds?
Is it too much to ask?
So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and in, put the EQ into our dynamic sidechain. And what we're doing, let me take it off for now. This is not going to sound good, by the way, but what I'm doing here is I'm boosting the top end here with a kind of a wide Q. I'm going around 7K because that's where she seems to be.
Is it too much to ask that you
nice wide.
be all mine? Is it too
Yeah, somewhere around there.
Is it too much to ask that?
So I'm really boosting that top end. I'm also boosting it up here as well.
Is it too much to ask that you?
All right. So I'm really driving that. I'm also pulling out some low end. Then I'm putting the EQ into the side chain here for the compressor. So that means since these high end, these S sounds are really sticking out and I've really boosted them, they're going to, to be the sounds that trigger compression instead of, just, the entire frequency range of her voice. Okay. So what ends up happening is because those S sounds are boosted so much, they trigger the compressor more or the expander more, right? We have it on invert here, by the way. And then it pulls all of that down. Okay. So check that out now.
Is it too much to ask that?
Right. We've de-essed that again by using compression. We're using, again, dynamic sidechain of the EQ. We're compressing that. In this case, I have a fast attack. I'm just making sure I set my threshold correctly.
Is it too much to ask that you? Is it too?
A little too much there.
Is it too much to?
And if I didn't have my expander on here.
Is it too much to ask?
All right. So again, with our expander, let me put that on normal here.
Is it too much to ask?
I don't want that. I just want it on invert.
Is it too much to ask that you be all mine?
So just when those S sounds come through is that expander going and that compressor going. Well, not just the S sounds, but, high end or harsh sounds.
I just want you with me all the time. Is it too much to ask?
All right, so we have de-essed that.
Is it too much to ask that?
By using the, sending the equalizer to the side chain, using compression and expansion here, in this case, inverting it, and really boosting the top end and pulling out the low end on the EQ that again is sent to the dynamic sidechain.
Is it too much to ask that you be all?
All right, so moving on, let's get to this side of our SSL desk now. So we have input gain, same thing on the G, by the way. This is pretty obvious, at least it should be for most people, what the input gain is. So if I had a very low signal, for example, drive the input more, you can do that, of course. Let me pull this back up a bit. Or if it's a little too hot, a little too crispy coming in, you can pull it down. All right. Now, of course, adjusting this is going to affect our compressor, right, and things like that, because of how hard it's going to be, getting hit, right? Pull it down. It's not getting hit as hard. Pull it up. Obviously, it's going to hit it, hit it harder. By the way, we can switch our meters down here. Right now it's on out. We can switch that to in. You can see that right there. So what is V-gain? Well, V-gain simulates the noise that's present in all analog circuits, okay? So this is sort of where you get some of that analogness from. Now, you may be able to hear this. There is some low-level noise going on right now. I take this off solo. All those desks are being combined. Maybe you can hear that, maybe you can't. I'll try to jack it up a bit in post so you can hear it. Of course, this is very low-level noise. Put this back on solo. So there's actually noise going on right now, and we can dial that in or out with this knob right here. So pulled all the way down, we're not going to hear anything at all. If you don't believe me that there's sound, maybe you can't hear it. Maybe you're watching on a phone or something like that. You probably can't hear this at all. But we'll have this analyzer right here, so you can actually see as I pull this up, there's noise there. Okay. Pull it up more. Now I have this jacked up here by 10 dB. Okay. So that's why, that's why it's so present. It wouldn't be that present probably in your actual mix, but This noise is what's going to give you sort of that analog sound, especially whenever you consider all of this, all of the consoles, assuming you put it across all of your channels, all of those consoles together, sort of this analog noise, this distortion, the saturation, maybe some warmth, right? Of course, THD comes into play in that as well. And THD is total harmonic distortion. Okay, so we can dial in some of that saturation. Now, of course, there's going to be noise going on all the time if you have any V-gain setting. So, as you should probably realize, you could use your expander for that. If you're not using your expander for anything else, then you just want to cut noise out, in between phrases here. Just make sure your expander's on, turn your range up a bit, and it goes ahead and tames that really low level noise for you, so it's not bleeding through, in your tracks there, in the parts where nothing is going on. But it's a good idea to have some noise, because if you have no noise at all, it's not going to sound accurate to anything that's actually analog. So for example, if we have this guitar phrase here, and right now we have this V gain up really high, THD up really high, you can probably hear that a bit. And maybe you don't want to hear that in between your phrases, so just make sure your expander's on. You can hear some of that noise in there. Again, just make sure you're pulling out, some of that low-level noise if you don't want it in these areas right there. Okay. And let's come up here now to this sort of vocal, and we'll mess around with our V gain here and our THD. Sort of hear what this actually does. I'll play that back.
You thought that you would use me, but love is so confusing. When I fell, you didn't even try to pick me up. You thought I wouldn't leave. How could you be so naive? You chased your heart, ignored the signs painted above.
Come back here, and we'll turn this all the way off.
Ignored the signs painted above.
Yeah, sounds better with some of that V gain and some distortion here. It breaks up a little bit more.
Ignore the signs painted above. I just want to be left alone.
So that is your V gain and your THD. All right, again, for the sort of analog noise and then total harmonic distortion right here. Always a good idea to have some noise, and you can, of course, decide how much of that THD you want. You should have a little bit, just to give it some saturation, some color, but you don't have to go crazy if you don't want to. Now, for our THD and our V gain, up here at the top, you can see where it says V gain all and THD all, okay? So what this lets us do is let's come down here and grab a couple more desks. And these are all E's. Of course, anything I change here for the all is not going to affect any of the G desks, okay? You can, of course, build yourself a hybrid sort of a mixer where you have some of the E desks, some of the G desk, maybe some of the Neve desk, and have all of this different analog noise going at the same time to have a different sound that wouldn't be possible in the real world. But back here to V gain and THD all. So right now, if I have a setting here at minus 84 here, we'll have minus 103 here, then maybe this one will be off, okay? I can come to any of these here that I want, grab this, and I can say turn V gain down minus 30 dB in relationship to whatever setting I happen to have on each desk, okay? So I can jack this way up to plus 20, but of course, if this is at 70, then I go up plus 20. You're not going to get any difference at all. Okay, same thing for the THD all. We can change that. As you can see, they all change here as I just adjust this one here. We can adjust that right here. Okay, again, it's in relationship to whatever the actual setting is. So let's look here at the manual for a better explanation of this. This parameter, the V gain all and the THD all. So this parameter lets the user add an additional offset to the V gain parameter, okay, to all console instances in his current session. Even with the offset, the original range of V gain parameter is never exceeded, okay? And if it's off, if it's explicitly off, it will stay off even when you add the offset. And then they give you some examples. So if V gain is minus 95, V gain all is plus 20, then the effective V gain will be minus 75. Okay, you know, obviously on that desk, not on all desks. Of course, it's relative to each, you know, to each desk. If it's on minus 75 with plus 20, then effective V gain will be minus 70 because it's limited by the upper range, as we know, right up here to minus 70 right there is as high as we can go. So even if I jack it way up, right, it's not going to make any difference on this desk here. It will on this desk, and it will, well, it won't on this one because this one here is off. If I bypass both of these desks, you can tell probably there's none of that analog noise because we have this turned off, even though we have our V gain jacked way up here on the, you know, on the offset. Okay. Whereas if I turn this desk on, you're going to hear that noise come back in, but it's not going to go any higher. Once I get to the plus here, it will go lower, but it won't go higher. You can tell from the expander down here too, by the way. Okay. So same thing, by the way, for the THD all. It's just an offset. So if you have a certain setting on your V gain or your THD, and you just need maybe a little more for everything or a little less for everything, instead of having to tweak all of those settings one by one, you can just grab it and adjust, you know, all relative to each other right there. All right, on to our phase reverse button right there. It's nice to have that built in right to the desk. So right here we have a stereo piano track, and this side of the track I reversed the phase, and we can actually see that as we zoom way in here, and you can see as I go up here, I go down here. As I go down here, I go up here, right? And that's going to put us out of phase the entire way. Of course, everything doesn't have to be lined up exactly, but this is out of phase, as you can clearly see. So first, we'll just hear this track here in mono. Okay. Now let me go ahead and hear both of these tracks together. Okay, again, a stereo track. So assume that you had two microphones on a piano and one is out of phase. Okay, so this red track here is out of phase. Go and play that back. So it might not sound too bad to you. It matters what you're using here. Let's open up this sound field here, and you'll actually see it's out of phase. So you can see way down here, it's on the -1 side. So if we collapse this down to mono here, let's go ahead and do that. But you see the problem here? We're out of phase. It doesn't sound good. It's all phasey, right? So that is what you can use your phase switch for. And again, it's going to be on every channel. So if you have, you know, different microphones on the same thing on different tracks, right, and you're out of phase, you can just pop it right here. All right. So let's hear what that sounds like whenever, let me actually go wide here, and we'll switch it as we play back. So it's out of phase right now. Boom. Now it's in phase. And again, we just switched one side of that track. You don't want to switch both sides of the track because then it's just going to, you know, they're both just going to flip. So obviously, sounding in phase, obviously much better. Let me put that back down to down the middle here. Let's turn that off and play back. Put it in phase, much better. Much better in phase. So that's what that phase reverse button does. And by the way, if you just want to see that actually, so here is the same track flipped, or I actually flipped around or committed our phase reverse right here. I just did that right there, reversed the phase, and went ahead and committed that track and rendered it out. So now whenever we look at these tracks real close, now you can see, of course, these two are reversed because this one here was reversed. Let's drag this one up here now to our original piano track. And now we can see, aha, now we're much more in phase than, than we were before, as you can see, coming down, coming up. Whereas we look at this track here, this one, again, this one here is the one that's out of phase. And now you can see it's matched up much better with the other microphone for that piano. All right, so that's what your phase reverse does. for those who don't know. And again, it's right there on each of your desks. So then another pretty obvious one is a mute button. So that way, of course, you don't have to come over here and hit your mute on your actual channel. So pretty self-explanatory, right? Mute, unmute, right? Pretty simple. Okay, so pretty self-explanatory, I know, but that's what it's for, to mute, just like it would be to mute here in your DAW. On to TMT. So what is TMT? You can see that right up here on these channels, TMT. On the stereo version, you'll notice we have 2 channels. On the mono version, we have 1 channel. TMT. What is TMT? So TMT is tolerance modeling technology. But what does that even mean? Okay, so in the analog world, right, in a real SSL desk or in a real EQ unit, in a real compressor, there's real parts, there's real capacitors, there's real boards, there's real filters, there's real things that have to be manufactured, right? And since it has to be manufactured by people or even machines, it's not going to be 100%. It's off by, a little teeny tiny amount, but it's not exactly the same. Whereas in the digital world, everything can be exact because it's zeros and ones. So you have a digital EQ, it can be exactly the same every single time. But in the analog world, there are teeny tiny little differences. And those teeny tiny little differences that you're going to see later go to make up a huge difference to the overall sound. So that is what TMT does, right? That's what TMT is. It models the tolerance of each component that goes into a real SSL desk, right? So if you figure of the thousands of different components, there's going to be a tolerance, a small tolerance. It's not going to be, I'm not talking about huge differences, right? You're not going to change your TMT channel and hear a gigantic difference. You're going to hear maybe on some channels a small difference. TMT is actually one of the biggest advancements in analog modeling probably ever, because this is one of the pieces that has been missing in a lot of other analog models of gear. Because again, if you model something and only model 1 channel of an SSL, for example, you just model 1 channel of an SSL, then you release that plugin, you slap that SSL plugin all across every single track, 40 tracks in your session. Well, guess what you're simulating? You're simulating taking all of your audio through 1 channel of a real SSL. Now, it'll probably sound fine, but going through a real SSL, each track, each audio track, is going to have its own channel. So that's sort of the same concept of TMT. It's modeling the tolerance of each part multiplied over 72 channels of an actual SSL desk. Okay? So all those little tiny differences from each channel go to make, the difference much more realistic, okay? So again, here on the mono version, you're only going to have 1 channel because it's like you're plugging into just 1 channel, which an actual SSL desk would just be 1 channel. But here on the stereo version, of course, we're going to have 2 channels because it's like plugging into 2 channels. Like if you had a keyboard plugged in to 2 mono channels for your stereo input. And that's what this analog button means. If I turn that off, you can see my TMT channel is going to be exactly the same. So in this case, it's going to simulate the same channel. In this case, channel 67 is going to be simulated for both sides of the stereo signal. If you want it to be more accurate to how it would actually sound, you can go ahead and put that on analog, and it would be, like you're plugging into 2 different inputs on an actual SSL desk. But you have that choice on the stereo version, obviously not on the mono version. So let's actually look at TMT here. Actually look at it, see what it sounds like, listen to it, and see if you can hear any changes between these channels. So I'm going to exaggerate this here to make sure we're really using each of those filters and those gain knobs. And we're really going to exaggerate that sound. Again, I don't have any audio running through this, but we don't need it because we know we can get that analog sound just by pulling up our V gain really high. Now this might sound annoying to some people, but you're going to hear the differences in this TMT. All right, so that's pretty good to start with. We're using pretty much everything here. So we're really going to hear these changes. So we can switch our TMT channel by just clicking a button one at a time. Or we can do random channel 1. And that randomly changes just the TMT channel for this instance of, in this case, the SSL 4000E desk. So I'm going to just go random here on these channels, and let's listen to some of the changes that happen. Again, I'm really overcompensating here. Plus 12 dB there, plus 10 dB here, jacking the EQ way up high. Let's just hit random and actually hear the differences that TMT makes. Big difference there. Hear more high end in that one. More mid-range. Much more high end there. Okay. So again, we were really driving that hard just to get the noise so we can actually hear sort of what that noise is. Again, keep in mind that noise is going to be extremely low in your mix. You're not going to hear it like that, but that little bit of noise, a little bit of saturation, and the differences between those channels that you could actually hear go to make these desks, these plugins, sound more realistic than any of the other ones out there. So then we have the random channel here. We already saw the random 1, but we also have all. And let's pull this up here. So what all is going to do is for all instances of whatever desk you're using, whether it's the E or the G, it will change, randomly change the TMT channel for all of them. Okay. Now, if I hit random all on the E desk, it's not going to change anything on the G desk, okay, or the in or the Focusrite or anything like that. It's just going to change the TMT channels for the E. All right. So if I just hit all, you're going to get a warning. You can, click that so it doesn't show again. Okay. And now you can see what happened there. These change, that change, to just random channels, right? Let's do it again. We'll hit all, and they all change there. So this is a quick way to, if you open a session, you start throwing this plugin across all of your channels, and you don't want everything going through 1 and 2, obviously. So just hit all a couple times. Let me just turn that warning off a couple times to randomly assign, different channels to every audio track, and then you're going to get that analog sound, much more analog sound than you would from other desks, because it has the differences, the tolerances of each part modeled across every channel, which of course, obviously, makes it much more realistic, which we're going to hear next. So let's look at the difference that small little differences between audio tracks make. All right. So right here we have the awesome Diesel Herbert on this guitar track. Okay. Now, what if I want a nice wide wall of sound? What I've done is I've duplicated this track, put it right down here. So now it's duplicated. So now all I have to do is pan these hard left and right, and then I'll get a nice wide sound. Let's look at the sound field here first on the mono. So mono track, let's play it back. All right, so I want a nice wide wall of sound. All I have to do, duplicate my track, which I've already done, pan this one left, pan this one right. Okay, everything else is exactly the same. The Herbert's exactly the same on both of these. Settings are exactly the same. Pull them both in. I play back and I get a wall of sound, right? Nope. All I get is more volume. It doesn't sound wider. It doesn't sound like it's coming from the left and the right. It sounds like it's mono. It sounds like it's coming right down the middle. Why? Because there's zero differences. Zero differences between these two audio tracks. And it's those tiny little small differences that make something sound wide. Okay, so if I really wanted to do this properly, I would use, or I would go to record this track again. I would physically sit down with my guitar and play this over again. And even if I played it in time again, 100%, at least from what I could tell, it wouldn't actually be 100%. Little parts would be 5 milliseconds late, 5 milliseconds early, something like that, right? There's going to be a little tiny differences between each pluck. I'm going to hit the string slightly differently between both performances. It's not going to be 100% exactly the same. And it's those small, tiny little differences that make everything sound wider and gives it depth. It's the differences that makes it sound, of course, small differences. You don't want giant differences, because then everything is going to be sounding horrible, of course. But small differences in your performance are going to make a huge difference to the overall sound, which is why people double track guitars. Now, something you could do if you happen to have the Plugin Alliance subscription, or you just own this plugin, is you could come up here and you could grab BX Stereo Maker. So Stereo Maker does something pretty cool. It actually sort of dynamically changes the balance between each side, right? Like sometimes the left is a few milliseconds ahead. Sometimes it's a little bit, behind, but it makes the sound. Let me take this off stereo here. Okay. But it actually, it widens the sound and sort of simulates actual double tracking. Right. So now it sounds wide. That's by using this plugin, which again is sort of putting some delays in there. Let's look at it on our scope here, and you'll see what I mean. So bypassed, introduce those changes now with our Stereo Maker. You can see that there. We could also, let me get rid of Stereo Maker here. Okay, now everything is back to being 100% the same. Playback again. So on solo, take this there. Okay. I could also do this. I could put tiny little change. Let's go to samples here. And let's put this ahead by, I don't know, let's say 30 samples. 30 samples is not much, okay? As you're going to see as I squeeze this back down. It pretty much, it looks like it's in time, right? Everything looks completely in time. Unless you take a real close look. But again, we changed nothing. And previously, whenever we played back and everything was simply duplicated, it just came right down the middle, right? Well, now by introducing a teeny tiny little change, watch what happens. We get width. We get stereo width and stereo separation. Now that's a little too much. I'd probably pull that back to 10 to 15 to 20. That'll tighten it up a little bit more. It's a little bit wide there, but pull it up here now. That's a little better. Okay. So again, why am I showing this? It's because I'm showing the differences that, the small differences that tolerance modeling technology makes. Because again, you're modeling the tolerance of each component, right? So there's, again, phase differences, timing differences, saturation differences, all kinds of differences that go into making your mix like that, instead of everything being through the same exact channel and it being like that, okay? I can show this further by, I've already squeezed this down, okay? Or put it, back to exactly down the middle. So it's exactly starting at exactly the same time. It's just a duplicated track. Now, what if instead of using the same Diesel Herbert, I just used, bypass that, I used a different amp. So I'm not going to change anything else, right? I'm not going to change the timing of this track. I'm not going to, change anything else. I'm just going to have a Herbert here and the Engel here. And of course, the Engel is made with different parts. The parts react differently, and the impulse response is going to act differently than the parts, the filters here in our tone stack, the way the compression works with the distortion, the transformers, so on and so forth, and of course the impulse response. Okay, they're going to be different. So those small differences in each component are going to make a difference, even though our track is lined up perfectly and simply duplicated. So now what happens? Again, we get width. Why do we get width? Again, tiny little changes, tiny little differences in timing, in phase, so on and so forth, which is what that TMT is going to give you that other plugins just aren't going to give you, because they're not modeling multiple channels and the tolerances of each component. They're just modeling one channel and saying, there you go, slap the same channel across your entire mix and mix through one channel of an SSL desk. I mean, nobody would plug every channel, every track into one channel of an SSL desk. It just wouldn't happen, right? You'd plug into separate channels and it's going to sound different, obviously. So that is TMT. Let's move on to a couple more things here. So the meter, we've already looked at the meter, but I'll look at it again here. So right now it's set on output. Switch it to the input there. Okay, simple stuff there. If I play back, it's on output. I can switch this over. We can still see the input. We'll look at our solo up here. So we have E and SSL solo. Of course, this is on the stereo version. You're not going to see this in the mono version, obviously, because it's just going to have a mid. And by mid, I don't mean frequency range mid. I mean middle, like the middle that's coming towards you. Just like we saw in using Insight here, we saw when something was wide, so that's the sides versus coming down the middle, right? So we can solo the middle and the sides to hear how this is, how our EQ or compression is affecting those things differently. So let's check that out here. Let me just bypass everything for now. All right, so let's go ahead and turn this on. So that's the mid content that we're soloing. And that's the side content, okay? So again, you can just sort of solo those and really hear what's going on in each of those, in the mid and then on the sides. That might help you make better mixing decisions, right? All right, so that is all of the functions here of our solid state logic desks. There are a couple more things. There's the money icon here. If you have to, if you're using like a trial or something, you can click that, go to the website. You can check your license key by clicking that. You can click the question mark and open the manual, or these here will take you to the website there as well. Of course, I don't think I mentioned it explicitly, but you do have a master fader there for each channel as well. It's pretty self-explanatory. All right, then across, let's go across the top here real quick and cover this stuff. So 100%, we can actually change the size of this interface. I can barely see that one there on my screen. Now I can't go up to 150 because of the size of my screen, but if you have like a 4K monitor, that should work for you if you need something a little bit bigger. We have a master bypass right here. Okay, of course, in your DAW, you're going to have your own bypass that might be located somewhere else, depending on the DAW that you have. We have a drop down here, and this is Pro Tools, by the way, for presets that come with it. In other DAWs, your presets are going to be located in a different area. We have undo and redo. So if I do something here, I can undo, redo, so on and so forth. Pretty simple stuff. We have A, B, C, and D there. So I have some setting here that I want for A. I can come over here to B and have completely different settings. Same for C and D. I can A and B and C and D between all of those settings real quick and real easy there. If I like something on, let's just say B, for example, I can hit copy. I'll come here to C, I'll hit paste, and it's going to paste those settings in there for me. So maybe I just want to make a small little tweak to that, and then I can A and B or B and C, those two settings real quick. If there's something I don't like at all, I can just hit reset, and we'll completely reset it. How do we get the SSL desk across our tracks as quickly as possible? Well, this is going to vary depending on the DAW that you have, but we'll look at it here in Pro Tools. So generally, if you're going to use something like an SSL desk, you're going to want it across at least the majority of your tracks, because you want each track going through the SSL to give you the real SSL sound. If you just have it on one track, okay, well, it's going to give that track the SSL sound, but it's not going to give your entire mix, the SSL sound. So if you have a ton of tracks, it can, of course, obviously be hard to come through each of these and have to go through your inserts and add the, the channel over and over and over again. So much easier here to do in Pro Tools, for example. What you can do is just hold down Alt. That's it. Hold down Alt. Click your insert. You can release Alt now, and then we'll go ahead and open up our desk, and we'll just choose, let's just say the E, select that. And now it's going to, as you can see, activating the inserts across all of these different channels all at once. Alt in Pro Tools essentially means all. So if you hold down Alt and do some action, it's going to say all. So in this case, on all inserts on stereo tracks, it's going to insert that desk. As you can see now, it's inserted that desk all across my session. Now, it did not insert it on mono tracks because they're a different width. Okay. So if you have mono tracks, you just repeat that thing. Just hold down Alt, click here, and call up your desk, and it will go ahead and put that across all of your mono tracks as well. You also have the option, if you don't want to put your SSL desk, I'm going to hold down Alt right now. I'm going to click here. I'm going to release Alt. I'm going to say no insert. That's going to remove all of them, by the way. That's just a Pro Tools tip. If there's only some tracks you want to put that across, instead of holding down Alt, we can use the modifier Shift. I'm going to select this track. I'm going to Control select that track, and maybe that track, and then let's just say that track. Okay. So if I just want my desk across my selected tracks, I can hold down Alt Shift, click any of the inserts, release my keyboard keys, and then go ahead and call up my desk. And that will put it just on the selected tracks. Boom, boom, and down here and right there. Well, over here in Studio One, what I could do is select my tracks. Here, let's just say those tracks. And then I could drag my console onto any of them here. And that will go ahead and instantiate that console across all of those tracks for me all at once. As you can see there, I can select this track, open up the mixer so you can actually see how that's laid out right there. Okay, we just select all these tracks, just Shift select all of those, right click, and let's just say remove. Do the same thing again, select all of those tracks, just Shift select the ones that you want, all those. You can drag it down here to the mixer as well. Just drop it on an insert, and it will go ahead and put our console across all of our tracks. So we're set up and ready to record. And of course, what we would want to do after we do that is go ahead and hit random a couple times. Turn that warning off. All, and now we'll have random channels across all of our different consoles. All right, so the next thing to consider is where exactly do you want to place your desks? Do you want to put it before other plugins or after other plugins? Well, that really just sort of depends. Now, in some cases, the answer is going to be pretty simple. So you remember that guitar track we had earlier. So we have the Diesel. In this case, we're going to use the VH4 on, this is a great amp sim, by the way, the absolute best Diesel VH4 you will find anywhere. I absolutely guarantee it. There's nothing better than this one. If I have a guitar amp or a bass amp or something like that, let's just play it back here first. I'm not going to want to put my SSL desk before this, because what happens? Well, if I put my SSL desk before my amp, well, I would be EQing and compressing the raw audio. So if I bypass the amp, that's what I would be EQing and compressing if I put my desk before the amp. Okay. So all you have to do to figure out where you want your desk is just think about signal flow. Do you want to compress, filter, EQ, add, V-gain, saturation, and THD? Do you want to do that to the raw sound, or do you want to do it to the affected sound? Now, obviously, in the case, again, of a guitar amp, we would want to do that after the guitar amp, because that's after the amp, after the cabinet. So in this case, pretty simple to figure out where I would want to put my desk. I want to put my desk after, in this case. Either one, E or G, just choose the one that you like best. So now, if I use the desk, if I want to pull out some of this mid, I want to add little bit there. Maybe a little chunk on the bottom. I'm going to cut out a little bit here. Obviously, if this came before the amp, that's going to sound radically different because now I'm EQing and compressing before I'm even going into the amp. Which, by the way, you can do if you want. It'll be technically, well, I don't want to say technically wrong because there's no wrong or right, but generally you wouldn't do that before you send it into an amp, of course, unless you're using pedals or whatever. So again, in this case, pretty simple to figure out where you want your desk. But it's not always so clear. What about in a case like this here? So let me bypass those for now.
You got the best of me.
All right, that's just dry. So say I have delay, which we have. This is a great delay, BX delay 2500. And we have rooms on there, BX rooms.
You got the best of me.
So we have delay and reverb on this track. Where do I put my desk? Well, it kind of depends. Again, all you have to think about is signal flow. What signal do I want to compress, filter, and EQ? Do I want to compress, filter, and EQ this signal?
You got the best of me.
Or do I want to, run this signal through the desk, compress, EQ, so on and so forth, and then send it to the delay and the reverb?
You got the best of me.
So, I mean, that's up to you. There's no right or wrong answer on this. For me, what I would probably do for this, personally, for me, I would probably put my SSL desk first and go ahead and tune it up to the way I want it to sound. So I'll just say grab the G here real quick.
You got the best.
We can get rid of some of that low end.
You got the best.
I want some sparkle on her.
You got the best.
I'm going to drive this a bit. What about...
You got the best of me. I could have set you free. You caused my insanity.
Okay.
You got the best of me. I could have set you free. You caused my insanity. You're my calamity.
So I'm getting that set up the way I want it first, and then I'll send it to my delay and my reverb. And go ahead and pop those two in.
You got the best of me. I could have set you free.
Versus having this after.
You got the best of me. I could have set you free.
So again, there's no right or wrong way on this necessarily. Now, for that delay, I don't know if I want compression after that technically. I definitely wouldn't. I mean, I wouldn't for this, but I mean, you can. So again, just my personal preference in this case, I would have my desk before these effects, again, personally. And if I wanted another EQ after, you could always put another desk in, or more than likely, what I would do is just choose a different EQ. And there's plenty of EQs that are kind of, come with the Plugin Alliance subscription. There are tons and tons of different EQs that you can use. You could even use, maybe you have the G desk here. You could throw in another, maybe throw in the E desk and just bypass your dynamics there and just use, just use the EQ if you wanted to do that. So why use a channel strip plugin instead of just using individual plugins? Well, that's absolutely fine. There's plenty of individual plugins that will work fine together. The reason why you might want to try a channel strip plugin is because it has all of the tools built in. So imagine plugging into your audio interface or a mixing board or something like that, right? For every microphone that you plug into that, you're going to have filters, you're going to have a compressor, you're going to have an expander, you're going to have your EQ, and all of those are going to work together. They're made to work together and to sound like a cohesive unit. So that's why you might want to try a channel strip, because it combines all of the most used tools all together, all quick and easy to get to. You can make your basic adjustments or more advanced adjustments really quick. Go ahead and get your mix set up and ready to go. And again, with a really tried and true sound, like our SSL desks here. So which of these desks should you use? Well, it really doesn't matter, and it also depends. It depends on the sound that you want. You got to keep in mind, there's different EQ modules in here. There's, different components for our filters or compressors. They're going to sound, it's going to sound slightly different. Now, you're not going to do a mix, let's say a full mix using just the G. You're going to get to the end and you're going to say, wow, this mix is horrible. If I just would have used the E with the same exact settings, everything would sound great. That's not going to happen. The difference isn't going to be that huge and that different. There is a difference. Most people say that the G unit has more mid-range punch. CLA has described it as, he calls it grit, grind, and gain. You might get more, some people say more clarity, more presence maybe on the E, and then more mid-range punch on the G. All right, so you're just going to have to try them out. There's no right or wrong. You can do a great mix on either of these desks. So the best thing to do is, to really hear the difference is to use your own content and just, make some simple changes on 3, 4, 5 different tracks. Doesn't have to be something crazy. And then sort of A/B between both desks, try to set everything essentially to the, same level, and just see how things go. Of course, change your EQ types and try your E dynamics on your G and try your G dynamics on your E. And also, you don't have to be locked in to just using, say, the SSL 4000E across every track in your session, or the G across every track in your session. You could do some tracks have the E, other tracks have the G, and make your own hybrid analog mixer. So you're not locked into one or the other. You can actually use both in conjunction, or even throw in a Neve desk throughout there, throw in the Focusrite desk, throughout the same session, and really give yourself a completely different sort of a hybrid sound by combining all of the analog flavors of these of all these different desks from Plugin Alliance. All right, so that is the definitive guide for the Brainworx BX console, SSL 4000E and SSL 4000G. Every single parameter, seeing what every single thing does. So now you can get back to actually mixing, and you can actually understand how these desks work. Because if you've never seen one, you've never used one, they can look kind of confusing. But once you understand how they work, you can actually apply everything you know now to every single channel strip from Plugin Alliance and every single channel strip from any other company as well.